It's funny how the worst nightmares often start in the most mundane of places. For me, it began with a single, dark green trash can and the quiet, peaceful street I thought would be my forever home. I'd spent months looking for the perfect place, a small slice of suburban heaven where I could finally put down roots. The kind of place with manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and a sense of community. What I didn't realize was that behind the perfect facade of my new neighborhood, a predatory force was lurking. A force that would try to take advantage of me and nearly succeeded in turning my dream into a living nightmare. It all started with a fine. Not a fine from the city or a ticket for parking on the wrong side of the street. No, this was a fine from a mysterious, unknown entity slipped into my mailbox in a nondescript envelope. $100 for a trash can placement violation. I remember laughing it off, assuming it was a mistake or some kind of weird scam. But then another one came, and another, and another, each one for a new, bizarre infraction. A trash can left out too long, a recycle bin placed on the wrong side of the driveway. The amounts grew exponentially from $100 to $200, then $500, until the fines totaled over $2,000. It was an absurdity so ridiculous it was almost unbelievable. It felt like I was being stalked by a phantom, a ghost of an organization that existed only to make my life miserable. Then came the certified legal document, a thick packet of official-looking papers demanding immediate payment of over $2,200 and threatening a lien on my property if I didn't comply. That's when the laughter stopped. It was no longer a bizarre nuisance. It was a real, tangible threat to the single largest investment of my life. I was terrified. It felt like I was in a bad movie, but the monster wasn't some shadowy beast. It was this faceless, heartless bureaucracy. I had no idea who was behind it or why I was being singled out. I felt helpless and completely alone. But as I sat there, staring at the demand for payment, something shifted inside me. The fear turned into a quiet, simmering anger, not the kind of anger that makes you scream, but the kind that makes you methodical. The kind that makes you want to get to the bottom of things, no matter what. It was time to stop being the victim and start being the hunter. The first thing I did was reread every single document that had been given to me, every flyer from the title company, every closing document, every piece of paper I had signed. And that's when I found it. The crucial detail. A small, almost missable paragraph that stated there was no active HOA. That one sentence changed everything. It meant there was no organization. There was no bureaucracy. There was just a person. A person with a personal vendetta against me, using fake authority to try and steal my money. And in that moment, the entire narrative of this story changed. It wasn't a fight against an organization. It was a fight against a single individual. The fines, the intimidation, the threats, all of it was being orchestrated by one person, a person so brazen and so arrogant that they thought they could get away with it. And I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the very documents they had used to try and intimidate me would be the exact same ones I used to take them down. I wasn't going to just win this fight. I was going to expose them to the entire neighborhood. And I was going to make sure they paid for every minute of stress they had caused me. This was no longer just about me. This was about justice. And I was going to make sure that everyone knew exactly what happened. With my newfound resolve, my first step was to drive around the cul-de-sac and soak in the scene. I wanted to see the stage and the players, now with a completely different understanding of the game. Our neighborhood was exactly what you'd imagine a suburban Texas street to be: immaculately kept lawns, two-car garages, and a mix of young families and retired couples. The houses were all fairly similar, with subtle variations in their landscaping or exterior colors. It was the kind of place that looked perfect, but as I was discovering, perfection often hides a dark underbelly. And that dark underbelly had a name. Her name was Patty. She lived 2 doors down from me, in a meticulously kept house that somehow managed to look both pristine and utterly sterile. Every blade of grass was the same height, and the flower beds were arranged in a rigid, almost military-like formation. I'd only exchanged a couple of brief, strained pleasantries with her in the first few weeks, and each interaction left me with an unnerving feeling. She had a perpetual scowl on her face and an air of superiority that made you feel like you were constantly being judged. She carried herself like she was the queen of the cul-de-sac, the supreme authority on all things suburban. And in her mind, I was the peasant who had dared to disrupt her kingdom. It was an unspoken power she wielded, based on a set of unwritten rules that apparently only she knew. I had no idea these rules existed, and I was pretty sure the other neighbors didn't either. They were things like trash cans must be placed at a 45-degree angle to the curb, or recycled materials must be separated into 3 different bins, not just the 2 provided by the city. Absurd, microscopic details that no one in their right mind would ever notice, much less enforce. But for Patty, they were a full-time obsession. It was her life's work to ensure every single rule was followed to the letter, and to punish anyone who dared to deviate. I had a feeling I wasn't her first target, but I knew I would be her last. As I drove, I saw a couple of my other neighbors out, tending to their yards. I waved, and they waved back, a couple of them giving me a sympathetic glance. It made me wonder how many of them had also been targeted by Patty's bizarre campaign. How many of them had paid the fraudulent fines just to make the problem go away? I felt a wave of empathy for them and a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just my battle anymore, it was our battle. Patty had been preying on new homeowners for who knows how long, taking advantage of their lack of knowledge about the neighborhood and their desire to avoid conflict. She was a petty tyrant, a one-woman HOA, and she was about to be put out of business. I parked the car in my driveway and sat for a moment, just thinking. This whole situation was so ridiculous, it was almost funny. I had moved into this quiet, peaceful neighborhood to escape the chaos of the city, only to find myself in a bizarre, low-stakes war with a woman who was obsessed with my trash can. It was the kind of thing you read about on the internet, and now it was my reality. It was a perfect storm of petty power, an inflated ego, and a complete lack of a moral compass. It's the kind of story that just begs to be told. The kind of story that makes you want to grab a bowl of popcorn and settle in. It's also the kind of story that makes you wonder about your own neighbors. You know, that one person on your street who seems to take their lawn a little too seriously, or who is always watching from their window. It's enough to make you paranoid. But hey, that's what makes these stories so great, isn't it? If you've ever had a neighbor like that, a real-life Patty, let me know in the comments. I'm betting I'm not alone in this. And with that thought, I got out of the car, ready to take the next step. I had a feeling Patty was about to find out what happens when you mess with a homeowner who knows their rights. And she was going to hate it. My first step, it turned out, was simply to wait. I was so convinced that I had the upper hand that, armed with the knowledge of my rights, I could simply walk up to Patty, inform her of her legal shortcomings, and watch her crumble. But that wasn't how this game was being played. The fines didn't stop. In fact, after my brief moment of righteous triumph in my driveway, they came faster and with a vengeance. The first fine I'd received had been unsettling, but the subsequent ones were a slow drip of psychological warfare. The second envelope appeared in my mailbox exactly 1 week after the first. It was the same size, the same generic cream color, with the exact same printed return address. I felt my stomach clench as I pulled it out, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. This one was for a lawn care compliance violation. $150. I was confused and honestly a little impressed by the sheer pettiness of it all. I had mowed the lawn a few days prior, and it looked great. But the included photo, a blurry, grainy picture taken from a distance, showed a single clump of dandelions I had missed near the curb. This was no longer a faceless scam. This was personal. My initial attempts to be reasonable were met with the silent wall of a professional scammer. I tried the phone number listed on the fines again, and just as before, it rang 3 times before the line went dead. The message box was full, of course. Next, I decided to try a more direct, but still non-confrontational approach. I wrote a polite, carefully worded note. It said something like, "Hi, I'm the new homeowner at 123 Maple Street. I've received a few notices and wanted to clarify what HOA they are from, as I don't seem to be a member. Could you please call me so we can sort this out?" I signed it with my name and phone number, slipped it into a sealed envelope, and walked the 2 houses down to Patty's. I placed it gently in her mailbox, a small, white flag of peace in a brewing war. My note was met with absolute silence. For 3 days, nothing. I assumed she had either ignored it or simply didn't see it. I was about to give up on that strategy when another envelope arrived. This one contained a fine for $200 for a failure to maintain proper architectural uniformity. The included photo was of my mailbox, which, while not a brand new model, was perfectly functional. The absurdity of it was almost laughable, but the rising total was not. $350 and counting. The silence was the worst part. I would see her in her yard, tending to her perfectly manicured bushes, and she would simply turn her back to me. It was a calculated, cold-shouldered dismissal that felt more insulting than any direct confrontation. The fines began to arrive with increasing frequency. Sometimes it was every week, sometimes twice a week. Each one was for a more ridiculous, specific, and unprovable offense than the last. Unauthorized decorative bird bath. Violation of permissible exterior holiday lighting schedule. Failure to secure appropriate permission for temporary garden art. My internal monologue went from confused to exasperated to finally just numb. The total kept climbing, $550, then $800, then $1,200. The cost was beginning to sting, but the psychological burden was far heavier. I found myself looking out my window, watching her house. I would check the mailbox with a sense of dread. Every time I heard a car on the street, I would wonder if it was another one of her envelopes. She had effectively turned my quiet, peaceful street into a source of constant, low-level anxiety. I was a prisoner in my own home, a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone. The final fine arrived not in an envelope, but as a printed, full-color notice taped directly to my front door. It wasn't the usual dry, formal language. It was a direct, personal threat. The title, in bold, aggressive lettering, screamed final notice. Below it, in smaller but no less threatening font, was a demand for the entire sum of $2,200. The final line, a sentence that left no doubt about her true intentions, was scrawled at the bottom in thick, black marker. "Pay up or prepare for legal fees you won't forget." This was the moment. The line had been crossed. This was no longer a series of petty fines or a bizarre misunderstanding. This was a clear, unambiguous threat from a person who was so confident in her own lies that she was willing to escalate this to a full-blown legal battle. She thought she had me trapped. She thought I would buckle under the pressure and just pay her off. But what she didn't know was that with every fine, with every ignored note, with every moment of silence and dismissal, she wasn't just increasing the total I owed her. She was increasing my resolve. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about principles. And as I slowly pulled the note from my door, my mind was racing with one single thought. This was exactly the leverage I had been waiting for. That last, handwritten threat was the proof I needed. It was my ticket out of this absurd, anxiety-filled game and my entry into a real fight. Patty had been operating in the shadows, hiding behind generic envelopes and unlisted phone numbers. But with that final notice, she had made 2 fatal mistakes. She had shown her hand by directly threatening me, and she had provided me with the single most important piece of evidence, the return address. The address was not some corporate office or a law firm. It was a P.O. box, located at a small mail service store 3 towns over. I drove there the next day, a cold sense of purpose in my stomach, the certified letter sitting on the passenger seat like a loaded gun. The woman behind the counter was friendly and patient as I explained my situation. I showed her the document with its P.O. box number and asked if she could tell me who held it. She looked at me sympathetically, then explained that, Due to privacy policies, she couldn't give me a name. My heart sank, but only for a second. She could see the frustration on my face, and she paused, then said, "I can't tell you who it is, but I can tell you if they've had any recent deliveries." I told her that I was expecting a package from a specific person, a friend who lived in my neighborhood. "Would it be from someone named Patty?" I asked, my voice calm but my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't respond, but her eyes gave me all the information I needed. She knew Patty. I didn't need a name, I just needed to know that she was the one. And now I had my proof. I walked out of that store with the certified letter still in my hand, but with a renewed sense of confidence. The monster I was fighting wasn't a ghost or a bureaucracy, it was a person. A person who lived 2 doors down from me and was now 100% exposed. I drove straight back to my neighborhood, and as I pulled onto the cul-de-sac, my eyes went straight to Patty's house. I saw her in her front yard, trimming a rose bush with a set of shears that looked almost surgically sharp. A perfect picture of suburban tranquility, a picture I knew was a complete and utter lie. I parked my car, got out, and walked directly toward her. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. This was it. The main event. The confrontation. She looked up as I approached, her face a mask of practiced indifference. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with the fake sweetness of a venomous snake. I held up the certified letter, the one I had just been handed at the mail service store. "I just wanted to make sure you got this," I said, my voice steady. Her eyes flickered to the letter and then back to my face, a flicker of genuine shock and confusion in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too strained. "This has nothing to do with me." "Oh, I think it does," I said, my voice dropping to a low, calm whisper. "I have the certified letter you sent me. The one you signed." Her facade began to crack. Her face flushed a deep, mottled red, and her knuckles turned white as she gripped her shears. She looked like a cornered animal, and a small, satisfied smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're trespassing," she spat, her voice no longer calm or sweet, but raw with fury. "You have no right to be on my property." "You came to my property and taped a threat to my door," I countered, my voice still quiet. "I think the rules are a little different now." She took a step toward me, the shears still in her hand. "You're a disgrace to this neighborhood. You don't belong here," she hissed. And that's when it happened. She raised the shears, not to threaten me, but to snip a single errant leaf off her rose bush. A perfect, manicured bush, just like her life. And in that moment, I knew I had her. She was so obsessed with control, so terrified of anyone seeing the truth, that she couldn't even manage a real threat. She was all bark and no bite. "I think you're the one who doesn't belong here, Patty," I said, my voice a calm, final note. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you've done." Her face went white, the blood draining from it in a moment of pure, unadulterated shock. She knew she had lost. The game was over. The confrontation had happened. And it was all on her own terms. The war was officially on. As I walked away from Patty's house, leaving her standing there in a state of silent, seething fury, I felt a calm, righteous fire ignite inside me. The fear and anxiety that had plagued me for weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, methodical determination. I was no longer a victim, I was a strategist. The time for guessing games and polite notes was over. It was time to build a case. My first call was to a real estate lawyer. I didn't want to get into a shouting match in the street. I wanted to hit her where it hurt, legally and financially. The attorney I found was a no-nonsense man named Mr. Hayes, with a deep understanding of Texas property law. I scheduled an appointment for the very next day and spent the rest of the evening meticulously organizing every single piece of evidence I had collected. I laid out every single fine, every printed notice, every grainy photo of my lawn and trash cans. I had a file of my attempts at communication, a log of the phone calls to the fake number, and the receipt for the certified letter I had sent. I had a full timeline of events, from the first fine to the final, handwritten threat. I even had a screenshot of the paragraph in my closing documents that explicitly stated there was no active HOA. It was a beautiful, compelling collection of a liar's trail of breadcrumbs. When I sat down in Mr. Hayes's office, he listened to my story with a patient, practiced calm. I laid out the binder of my evidence, and as he flipped through it, his eyebrows rose just a little higher with each page. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, and I held my breath, waiting for his verdict. "This is highly unusual," he said finally, a flicker of a smile on his face. "In my 20 years of practice, I have never seen a more flagrant case of fraudulent misrepresentation. She has not only attempted to extort you but has done so in a manner that leaves a very clear paper trail. This isn't just a win, son. This is a landslide." He then confirmed my suspicion. The supposed HOA was not registered with the county, and their fines were completely fraudulent. We had a slam dunk case. The next step was to find out if I was the only victim. I had a feeling I wasn't. Patty's smug demeanor suggested a long-running scheme, a petty tyranny she had successfully exercised over the neighborhood for years. I started with the neighbors who had given me a sympathetic glance, and one by one, their stories began to unfold. The couple across the street had paid a $500 fine for improper fence staining. The family with 3 kids a few houses down had paid a $1,000 fine for a violation of front yard aesthetic standards because their children's toys were left out. The older couple had paid a $750 fine for noncompliance with exterior lighting. Each story was a new piece of the puzzle, and with each new piece, my righteous anger grew. These weren't just my neighbors, they were my co-conspirators in a fight for justice. We held an impromptu meeting in my living room, a secret gathering of disgruntled neighbors united by a single, powerful goal: to bring Patty down. There were 7 of us in total, all with similar stories and all with a desire to see her pay. We shared our stories, our receipts, and our frustrations. We were a small army, and our leader was a determined homeowner who had finally had enough. We pooled our evidence, creating a master file that was even more damning than my own. We had a financial paper trail that led directly to Patty's personal bank account. We had a timeline of her harassment, and we had witnesses who could testify to her behavior. We had a case so strong, so irrefutable, that there was no way she could win. Mr. Hayes was ecstatic. "This is even better than I thought," he said when I presented him with our collective evidence. "We can now pursue this not as a personal dispute, but as a community-wide issue of fraud and extortion. This isn't just a legal victory, it's a statement, and it's going to hit her harder than she ever thought possible." The plan was now simple and elegant. We would send her one final, certified letter, this one from my attorney. It wouldn't be a threat or a demand. It would be a formal legal notice, a simple, dispassionate document that would invalidate every fine she had ever issued and inform her that we would be seeking full reimbursement as well as punitive damages. It was the calm before the storm, and I knew with every fiber of my being that the storm was coming. The day of the meeting felt like a perfectly still moment before a storm. Mr. Hayes, my attorney, was with me. He carried a heavy briefcase that contained a copy of every piece of our collective evidence. We had sent Patty a formal letter just 2 days prior, a certified document from my attorney's office, a simple, dispassionate note informing her that her fraudulent fines were invalid and that we would be seeking a full refund for every dollar she had extorted from the neighborhood. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact, and I knew she would know exactly what it meant. We had invited the entire street to my home for what I called an emergency community meeting, and I had a feeling the attendance would be high. Patty arrived promptly, just a few minutes after the meeting was scheduled to start. She was with a man I assumed was her husband, a quiet, unassuming man who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. She wore her usual smug, confident smile, a mask she had perfected over the years, but I could see the cracks forming around the edges. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the small group of neighbors huddled together, her gaze lingering on the couple with the kids and the older man with the quiet demeanor. I watched her, a small, satisfied smile on my own face, knowing that in a few minutes, that mask would shatter completely. I began the meeting by thanking everyone for coming. I kept my voice calm and conversational, but with a serious edge. I know many of you are here because you've received fines from our so-called HOA, I started. And I'm here to tell you that this is not an HOA, and these fines are not legal. They are a fraudulent attempt to extort money from us. A collective murmur went through the room. Patty's smug smile didn't falter, but her knuckles turned white as she gripped her husband's arm. She was still confident, still sure of her own lies. She had no idea what was coming. Mr. Hayes then took the floor. He spoke with a quiet, authoritative presence, his voice carrying the weight of his experience. He explained in simple, easy-to-understand terms how he had cross-referenced the so-called HOA with the county records and found no legal registration. In short, he said, his voice firm and final, this organization does not legally exist. All fines issued by them are null and void. Patty's face went pale. The smug smile was gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. This wasn't the kind of confrontation she was used to. This was real. Then came the centerpiece of our case. I opened the binder I had so meticulously prepared and began to present the evidence. I started with my own story, the series of absurd fines, the escalating threats, the final handwritten note. I then called on my neighbors, one by one. The couple with the kids described their $1,000 fine for front yard aesthetic standards. The older man spoke about his $750 fine for exterior lighting. Each story was a new nail in Patty's coffin, a new piece of the puzzle that was now complete. The collective rage of the room was palpable, and Patty's smug demeanor was now a thing of the past. She was a cornered animal, and the walls were closing in. Patty finally lost her composure. She stood up, her face a deep mottled red. "This is a lie," she shrieked, her voice high and shrill. "This is a slanderous smear campaign. These people are just trying to get out of paying their fines." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a raw, desperate fury. "You have no right to do this. You have no proof." And that's when I delivered the final, devastating blow. I walked over to Mr. Hayes and he held up a thick manila folder. "Patty," I said, my voice calm and final, "I have proof. And so do my neighbors. We have a financial paper trail that leads directly to your personal bank account. We have every single fine you sent us, and we have a certified letter from my attorney telling you that we will be seeking full reimbursement for every single dollar you have extorted from this neighborhood." The look on Patty's face as the truth dawned on her was one I will never forget. Her mask of composure didn't just crack, it shattered. Her jaw went slack, her eyes widened in a moment of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at me, then at the man she had come with, who was now looking at her with a horrified, betrayed expression. She had been so certain of her victory, so sure that her petty tyranny was untouchable. But in a quiet living room, in a moment of pure, undeniable justice, her entire world came crashing down. The cathartic rush I felt in that moment was indescribable. It wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for the entire neighborhood. The silence in my living room after Patty's outburst was deafening. Her husband, looking utterly mortified, finally stood and took her arm. "Patty," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "let's go." She didn't resist. She simply allowed him to lead her out the front door and into the street, her shoulders slumped, her mask of composure now lying in a million little pieces on the floor behind her. My neighbors and I watched them go, a sense of quiet, solemn satisfaction settling over the room. There were no cheers, no high-fives, just a shared understanding that a long-running injustice had finally been put to rest. The fallout for Patty was swift and decisive. My attorney, Mr. Hayes, was a man of his word. He filed a formal demand for restitution, itemizing every single fine that had been paid and every fraudulent dollar Patty had extorted. He didn't stop there. He also filed a report with the county detailing her fraudulent scheme. The money, it turned out, had been used for a series of expensive home renovations that had made her house the perfect picture of suburban conformity. The very thing she had been punishing us for not having, she had been paying for with our money. The humiliation of it all was delicious. She was forced to sell her home to pay back what she had stolen. The last I saw of her was on a quiet Tuesday morning, a moving truck in her driveway, her meticulously manicured lawn now looking a little less perfect. She was gone, and with her, the anxiety that had hung over our neighborhood for so long. My life, and the lives of my neighbors, immediately returned to the peaceful state we had dreamed of. The neighborhood felt different. The fear of an impending fine, the anxiety of being watched, was gone. We were no longer a collection of isolated homeowners. We were a community, a group of people who had banded together to fight for a common cause. We now had a real, registered HOA, one that was run by a board of trusted neighbors, and one that had clear, unambiguous bylaws that were adhered to. It was a victory not just for me, but for everyone who had been a victim of Patty's tyranny. Looking back on it all, I realized that the $2,200 I was almost scammed out of was the most expensive, yet ultimately the most valuable lesson in property law I've ever received. I learned that sometimes the small, quiet battles against petty tyranny require the biggest legal guns. I also learned that you can't be a victim if you refuse to play the part. Patty thought she had found a cash cow, a naive new homeowner who would be too scared to stand up for himself. She was wrong. She was a petty tyrant, a one-woman HOA, and she was brought down by the very people she had so arrogantly tried to control. The greatest lesson of all, though, was that in the end justice, no matter how small, is always worth fighting for. And the feeling of knowing you stood up for what was right is a reward that no amount of money can ever buy. If you enjoyed this story of a real-life villain getting their just desserts, please consider hitting the like button. And if you have a similar story of a petty tyrant getting their comeuppance, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. And if you want to be here for the next time I have to face down a small-town bully, make sure you're subscribed.